All right, hello everyone. Welcome to everyone's favorite session about legal and regulatory matters when it comes to crypto. I know it may not be the most sexiest subject, but it's probably the subject that's most pertinent to a lot of the listeners here today. I'm joined by Elizabeth Meade, a senior associate from Cooke, Young and Keidan. Elizabeth is a litigation lawyer who primarily focuses on when things go wrong in crypto. You're starting a new company, you're doing a DeFi project, you're doing a gambling protocol, perhaps you're starting an NFT. There are things that you should and shouldn't do. And Elizabeth here is the perfect expert to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. I have a series of questions that I'm going to run Elizabeth through and sort of take her through what perhaps new founders in the ecosystem will go through. But I think what would be really good for everyone here is if you have your own questions at the end of this and you want to ask anything, we'll give you a mic around. You can treat this as like a free consultation session with Elizabeth, maybe 5-10 minutes, and she won't charge you for it, I think. But okay, why don't we start off with Elizabeth, why don't you give us a quick introduction and tell us a bit about the clients that you work with?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to make clear that, am I really loud, or is that in my own head? Okay, great. Make clear that I'm a regulatory and disputes lawyer, so most of the time when a client comes to us, it's because they've already got a regulatory problem, or they strongly suspect they're about to have one. So often we would be dealing with the FCA on behalf of the client when you're at the really sort of sharp end of a problem. We also do sort of ongoing advisory work for existing clients, maybe who are looking to list a new token. So I do some of the forward-looking stuff, but my experience is sort of skewed towards the negative, so my answers might sound a little bit like that as well. On the litigation side, we act for crypto businesses, mainly exchanges, who might find themselves dragged into a fraud asset tracing case in the courts, or for crypto businesses who have disputes with their payment services providers or their own customers. And I'm also acting for a couple of the Bitcoin developers in the Tulip trading litigation, which has been brought by an entity controlled by Craig Wright. So there's a huge spectrum of work, really. Client-wise, from startup to some of the major global exchanges. So I've seen sort of from no in-house counsel to quite developed teams and work with them. So I've got a good breadth of type of client, I guess.
Okay. So the summary there was a few token launches, a few matters before, was it the FCA that was pursuing your clients, and then representing some Bitcoin miners in a Tulip mining case, is that correct as well?
Bitcoin developers, yeah.
Bitcoin developers, yeah. Exactly. Okay, that's very, very cool. Let's take a step back. So let's say I'm a very early stage tech founder. Founders may build projects without having a lot of the necessary structures in place, right? Developers like to ship fast and break things. And sometimes they don't necessarily think about, where should I register this company? Do I do it offshore? Do I do it onshore? Do I wrap it in some DAO legal entity wrapper? Do I have an opco? Do I fly to the Cayman Islands every 6 months? What's your position on this? What do you most see?
So by the time clients come to us, they're very much already established. But I guess what's most useful is to say what we are most commonly seeing, which is definitely entities that have been incorporated offshore. Often for a single business or project, there were multiple entities, with different entities being in charge of different aspects of the business. The most common ones we are seeing are probably Cayman and the BVI, with a bit of Singapore and Hong Kong thrown in. And I think there is a reason that we tend to see those jurisdictions arising. And one is obviously why the offshore jurisdictions are used by businesses generally, is for tax reasons, but also there are very sophisticated offshore law firms which can provide very sophisticated advice at the initial sort of setup phase to make sure that everything's structured correctly. Also, there's a sort of spectrum in the legal world of offshore jurisdictions, and some are much more respected than others because of the laws that they have in place. So jurisdictions like the BVI and the Caymans will have well-established anti-money laundering regulations, for example, which means that those jurisdictions don't find themselves on many of the blacklists that somewhere like the Seychelles might. So there's definitely a degree of sort of jurisdiction shopping that businesses do when they're at their very initial stage, and I think that will continue, but I do think it will get maybe slightly less effective because obviously one of the other benefits to being offshore is being, in theory, out of reach of some of the bigger regulators. But as crypto regulation develops, in the UK in particular, but also across the EU, and already the way it has developed in the US to the extent that you could say that they have crypto regulation, is that there is a certain amount of offshore reach going on. So the FCA, ever since the end of last year when it got some new powers in relation to financial promotions of crypto assets, has started going after offshore businesses to the extent that they have UK customers. So it's no longer so easy to sort of carve yourself out of this jurisdiction if you want to have customers that are here.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it also brings up a point that we were chatting backstage a little bit before about how there's a hierarchy in offshore entities. There's a difference between domiciling an entity in the BVI versus the Cayman Islands versus the Seychelles. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that for a second?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can look it up online. It will show you which offshore jurisdictions are on which blacklists, and it's going to be a lot easier if you're incorporated in a jurisdiction that is well regarded by the sort of global financial markets. Funnily enough, like New Zealand, where I am clearly from, is an offshore jurisdiction, and it is very well regarded in terms of the sort of safety of doing business there. It's not going to raise eyebrows, whereas the sort of across the hierarchy, the more obscure you go, you might find it easier to set up, but you're going to have problems operating down the line because people won't want to deal with a company that is incorporated in certain places realistically.
Interesting, okay. I'm going to have to cancel my Seychelles Corporation application.
Yeah, maybe.
Damn, I didn't realize, but thank you. Okay, my next question is just around like a general understanding of the regulatory landscape so far.
Yeah.
We're in a really great market right now. You know, tokens are performing relatively well, but we're really coming off the back of 2 years of extremely negative sentiment within crypto, with some really bad actors in the industry that have changed regulatory perspective on the industry in general. How do you see that developing from your perspective here in the UK?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been plans for a long time by the UK government to regulate crypto, and it's always been framed in a really, really positive light. So long before Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, he was saying, we want to make the UK a global crypto hub. And I think a lot of crypto businesses do want to see proper regulation because operating in a grey area is what makes it such a headache. You know, you'd rather know what the rules are than be trying to guess. But the regulation is very reactionary necessarily, so it is responding to what's been happening in the market. So I think the best sort of concrete example is that the UK has amended the Financial Services and Markets Act, which is like the major act that governs pretty much the way the whole financial services industry is regulated, and these amends were always intended post-Brexit. But originally, the only way that crypto was planned to be captured in that was stablecoins, because the government sees them as a systemic risk to the UK financial sector. But after the FTX collapse, there was a very sudden amend to the draft legislation to include crypto assets more generally, because there was a sudden recognition that probably things needed to move a bit faster. And so that has happened. That passed last year, but they're still waiting for the sort of secondary legislation that would actually make it mean anything for crypto businesses. But it's not an if, it's a when, and it could be later on this year that we start seeing a whole lot more of the industry pulled into the sort of FCA's regulatory remit, I guess. So yeah, it's very reactionary, but it has been in place a long time. And yeah, there's sort of a tension between the government saying we're going to be a hub, we want to welcome innovation here, but then in reality the FCA needs to enforce, and the way they go about that might not necessarily seem entirely consistent with encouraging innovation, we could say.
Yeah. I think very reactionary is a great way to summarize the majority of the legal industry.
Yeah.
That's how a lot of laws are formed in this space in general.
Yeah.
But I want to dive deeper on this, just on this specific point for a little bit longer. So let's say I'm a DeFi protocol.
Yep.
If I'm building the US, there are clear things I should be doing, right? I'm geo-blocking all of the US citizens. I'm making sure that any IP addresses that are coming through my front end are blocked. I'm making sure that none of my airdrop recipients are coming from anywhere close to the US. I'm putting it all throughout my terms and conditions. I'm posting it on Twitter. I'm making everyone angry, right? That's very standard and known in industry so far for the US.
Yeah.
Is that where it is at for the UK right now?
It's where it's going. It's not where it's at. So I think the UK sort of, I don't want to say panicked, but had to be seen to be doing something, and actually reforming your underlying financial services laws takes time. So instead what they have done is draw crypto assets within the financial promotions regime. And it's a quite uncomfortable fit because crypto assets themselves remain unregulated, but you can no longer promote them to UK consumers without certain permissions.
Right.
And if you don't want to go through the steps that you have to take to get those permissions, which is going to be registering as a crypto business here, putting a base here, or getting a third-party approver to approve everything that you do, so there's some businesses out there that are offering that service, then your other choice is to block services to the UK. So, I mean, there's other ways around it, but that's a very oversimplification. But yeah, we can see that it will be heading in that direction, but I think the hope is that the UK laws will be much clearer and more sort of permissive than the situation that you've ended up with in the US, where the SEC is so aggressive and sort of unpredictable that the much safer option for everybody is to withdraw from the market entirely. I don't think that's where we'll end up here at all. But yeah, it's certainly something that we need to be thinking more about, to the extent that they are promoting crypto assets, which is a very, very broad concept.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like until there are much clearer regulatory practices in place, the best practice is just to make sure that you're not overtly marketing, pushing, promoting your product.
Well, this could be a totally different talk, but yeah, overtly marketing versus what the FCA sees as a promotion is something that I'm currently engaged in. Yeah, it's a grey area, and every single thing that you say about every single product is sort of taken on its own. Yeah, it's not like, oh, you are promoting. It's like, that is a promotion. So yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, why don't we take a different track and we consider, well, just from your experience, like your most recent clientele, or perhaps your clientele that are most reflective of startups in the space, what's the most common theme that you see that typically goes wrong when they're starting out their business?
So either people will end up receiving a letter from the FCA that's sort of inquiring about their business, or they end up in a bust-up with very often a payment services provider or a customer. So yeah, it will be quite common for the FCA to send a letter out which will be asking for information about your activities, because one thing that is clear about the FCA is that it can guess what you're doing in a jurisdiction, and it can guess how your product or platform works, but they really want you to tell them so that they can decide what action they might want to take. So that would be very common, that we would see businesses receiving letters asking them to explain, and often we can explain, and it goes away forever, because there's been a sort of misunderstanding as to what somebody's actually offering, or how they are servicing clients in the UK, if at all. Or otherwise, yeah, what is quite common is people having disputes with their customers, and that can very often arise because I think at the initial stage there can be a real temptation to sort of copy and paste terms and conditions from someone else's website and put them on yours. And it's certainly a very cost-effective method of getting up and running, but it can create real problems if an issue arises down the line with a customer, particularly because there's a sort of weird catch-22 where once a customer has raised an issue, if you then go and amend your terms and conditions as a reaction to that, it's quite a strong point for the customer to make, to say, my reading of the terms and conditions must be right because you're so concerned about this that you've changed the wording, type thing. So not getting that right from the start can be, somewhere people can get caught.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this off stage, and that was actually something that really surprised me, because I feel like most DeFi protocols, at least to my knowledge, do copy paste the terms and conditions from a similar product,
Yeah.
perhaps on a different chain, just because it's like, what could be that different between our two terms?
Absolutely. And it's also like sometimes what people forget about is the quite boring topic of governing law and jurisdiction. And you might actually want, like a lot of the big global exchanges will have in their terms and conditions that if you have a dispute with them, you can't sue them. You will need to enter into arbitration, and it will normally be in like quite a random place.
This is really great alpha, by the way, guys. Yeah.
So
arbitration over litigation.
So that is going to be the preference for a business, is to arbitrate, because it happens in private. So everyone doesn't see the issues that you're having with your customers in the same way that they would if they sued you. Another thing that a lot of exchanges will often do that is sort of being tested in various test cases in the US is putting in a carve-out that will say you can't join a class action in relation to a breach of these terms and conditions, whether or not that is compliant with laws in different jurisdictions is anyone's guess, still being tested, but there can be little sort of tips and tricks that you might miss, or a big one is copying and pasting terms and conditions and ending up with the laws from a country that is totally inapplicable to where you're incorporated or to any aspects of your business, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think the way that a lot of founders typically think about this regulatory aspect is very much an afterthought to the product is done, now I just need something in place so that on face value, it looks like I can go to market.
Yeah.
But then what they don't realize is a year down the track, 2 years down the track, what you've had in place at that moment is going to impact on how well guarded you are 2 years later. And if you don't have the arbitration clause like you've mentioned, or you don't have a no class action requirement, like all of these things can significantly damage or open yourself up to much more damage in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, none of those things might work, to be clear. You know, there are ways to get around arbitration clauses. There's a big question mark over whether or not you can say to someone you can't join a class. Yeah. But there are things that you want to at least take advice on so that you know what options you've got, I guess.
Exactly. It's like adding more weapons into your armory and hoping you never have to use it.
Absolutely, yeah.
But let's touch on this now. Where do you get advice like this? Like as a startup, if I don't have that much money, I'm probably not going to hire a GC and pay them $250,000 a year and be competitive on the market. Or I'm not going to go to a top tier law firm and pay 6 figures in a monthly retainer just to have someone tell me to do my own terms and conditions. Like how does someone learn about stuff like this?
I think that's really hard for a smaller business, and I don't think the answer for everyone is hire an in-house counsel as one of your first 10 hires. But
so hire an in-house counsel is one of
Don't. I don't think that's the answer for everyone. I mean,
great.
it would be great if it was. But I think that there's been, naturally, because of what crypto businesses are doing, there's an inclination to be building from people who have a software and technology skill set, rather than more broadly people who have experience in financial services. And ideally you want someone within the business at an early stage who has operated in a regulated environment before. Mm-hmm. Because if you've only been in tech, you are just not going to be so alert to where the issues could arise. Mm-hmm. So having somebody on your staff who has that experience, because they might have worked for a fintech, say, or in very traditional financial services, will at least know when you might want to be asking for external advice, I guess.
Yeah, okay. I recall back when I used to practice, there was this big thing around top tier, mid-tier boutique law firms.
Yeah.
And there's this big demand with clients like, I want the biggest, baddest lawyer to tell me the exact same thing the other guy's going to tell me.
Yeah.
I guess, how do you see it, having worked in the industry now? Would you recommend a startup to go for the biggest, baddest name, or do you think finding someone in a
it's actually weird. So our firm is, we only do disputes work, essentially. So a lot of it's conflict free. So we would never act for a bank, say. Would act for claimants who wanted to sue a bank. Whereas in the crypto industry, we've found ourselves on the other side, where we mainly act for crypto businesses as opposed to like investors who want to go after a crypto business. And I think that, a smaller firm can be good for a crypto business because there's quite a lot of similarities in the way that they are run, because some of our clients are absolutely massive, and yet they will have a legal team that you might expect for a much, much smaller client who is operating in a more traditional financial sector. And there's much quicker feedback to management than you would expect. So I also think the area is very, very specialized, and what like big firms are maybe best at is a lot of people on a matter to help you, whereas for a lot of crypto questions, it's finding the people who have the right experience. So yeah, I mean, I think identifying an individual within a firm is much more important than whatever firm you're choosing, because there's going to be some people. I mean, some of the big firms have a lot of the big exchanges as clients. I'm sure they'd be absolutely brilliant. There's nothing to say that you shouldn't use a big firm. It's much more comes down to the skill set and experience of someone.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, so to summarize, it seems like don't hire in-house counsel too early. Rely on external
Feel free
expertise.
to, but as an alternative,
have the money.
You could go for someone who,
Go for someone who's more technically inclined, who understands the product, who's closer towards getting the company moving. Rely on external expertise where possible. And the name doesn't really matter. What really matters is the individual's experience and how well you're actually able to work with that specifically.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, that's great to know. That's great to know. All right, I want to change tracks a little bit to talk a bit about DeFi now.
Sure.
DeFi is like a huge focus for StarkNet, and it's probably one of the only areas within crypto that has shown product market fit to date so far. There are a lot of other areas like speculation, gambling, NFTs, gambling, all of these things that do show product market fit as well, but I would say DeFi to date so far has definitely been the one that's the largest. But a lot of people criticize DeFi and they sort of see it as the application of the same rules and structures of TradFi, but just in like a regulatory arbitrage, right?
Yeah.
You take a bank, you put it on chain, and now you don't need all the licenses of the bank. You take a perpetual futures exchange, you put it on chain, and now all of a sudden it's not speculation or derivatives. And then insert X TradFi product, put it on chain, and it's a permissionless DeFi primitive. How do you see that? Do you think that DeFi protocols are primarily regulatory arbitrage at this stage?
No, I don't. I think that when you're in a position like we are in the UK now, where the government is saying we don't know how to regulate DeFi, it's hard to say that people are avoiding using other structures for regulatory reasons, because I think one of the big problems that exists is it's like who's avoiding the regulation and what regulations are they avoiding, because something the government is sort of grappling with. It's a very stage-by-stage process, but for sure the first thing that's going to be captured is regular old sale of crypto assets, because everyone can see who you are regulating for that, and it's the person who's selling them. Whereas for a DeFi protocol, nobody's sure whether or not you want to be trying to regulate the original people who start the protocol, or the people who maintain the protocol, or the sort of on-ramps and off-ramps that allow people to interact with the protocol, or whether or not the concern is those who allow consumers to use that protocol, because there's a lot of financial services law that is purely there to protect consumers.
Yeah.
Or whether or not you should be looking at the underlying activity and how that relates to financial services, like if a protocol is for lending. And at this stage, there's so many unknowns that when we still don't have laws regulating a simple sale, I don't think it's fair to say that there's regulatory arbitrage going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think those are really good points. You can't really regulate something if you don't know who is doing it and what regulation is being broken.
Yeah.
So I guess as a founder who is trying his best to stay outside the remit of regulators, you really don't want to make either of those things clear, which is why I'm guessing people start DAOs and why people try to be as decentralized as possible so that there really isn't that core party that can be pinpointed, like, hey, you are the one who is running.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a lot of the sort of government's discussion documents are talking about like the phrase DeFi and how it's sort of a catch-all when really for some protocols there's actually not a lot of D.
Exactly. It's just fine.
Yeah. And so it is clearer in those scenarios who you might go after type thing.
Yeah.
But actually regulating for that is much more challenging. And the UK has definitely said we're going to wait and see what others do. We're not going to pave the way
So
here.
we're joining at 1:30.
Yeah, exactly. Before I sort of end it and leave Elizabeth with just a few pointers to give to different founders for today, I do want to touch on the fact that a lot of regulations today are a reaction to what's happened in the last preceding 3 months, 6 months, a year or so. And this is going to happen again in the next year and the year after that. It's very important to make sure that you have your ducks in a row. A very cheap lawyer or a very bad lawyer is a very expensive mistake to make. Just always make sure that you're protected, especially when you're building in a space that's as unclear as this. There are protocols and there are DAOs and there are groups of people that have built applications that have been really, really on the far end of decentralization. Right? You look at Tornado Cash or you look at UkiDAO. These are instances where people have really taken that ethos and moved it as far as they could with it. And it still has been retroactively seen to be a breach of XYZ regulation. So even with all of this, like with all this being said, like make sure that everything that you guys are doing and the products that you guys are building can be as safe and as clearly outside the confines of that as possible.
Yeah, because I think what makes being a lawyer for crypto businesses different from being a lawyer for almost any other industry is that normally a client will come to you and say, like, I want to do this, can I? Or I'm doing this, and someone tells me it's a problem, is it? Type thing. And the answer is normally in the law, whereas for crypto businesses, the answer will be in the law, sort of, but you also want to be looking ahead at what you can expect to be changing, because you don't want to be advising somebody who's about to put a whole bunch of money into launching something that you suspect in a year's time will be treated entirely differently from a regulatory perspective. So there's a lot of sort of future gazing that I guess goes on in our work that we wouldn't do with other clients because laws are very, very settled in most spaces.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's end on this last one. What are the top 3 things that you would advise an offshore founder to not do if they've just raised a small round, they have an MVP, and they're just about to go to market?
I think it would be a mistake to think that because you have incorporated offshore, that you only need to worry about the laws of that offshore jurisdiction.
Okay.
You need to be thinking more and more about where your customers are, because right now and over the next few years, that's going to be what is relevant in terms of what laws apply to you. I touched on this before, but yeah, making sure that you've got a sort of diverse background, skill set in your team. So you don't want everyone to be software developers. You want some people to have experience in a regulated industry, ideally. Mm-hmm. What would my third be?
Don't scam your users.
Yeah, don't scam your users. That's an excellent, That one does go without saying, so I didn't say it.
Great. I just wanted to make that clear.
It's a good third point. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Do you guys have any other questions? This is a free consultation session that lasts for another 5 minutes and 45 seconds. Elizabeth won't charge you, she won't have her timer on. But otherwise...
Nor can you rely on my advice as a consequence, but it's a good pointer. Yeah?
Exactly, listen to the actual one. Any questions at all? Oh, perfect. We have a hand up over there. The question was, are you generally optimistic or pessimistic about the direction the UK is going in terms of crypto?
I'm middling. It's
that means pessimistic.
Yeah. There's a lot of asking the industry what they think. So if you read the consultation documents, there'll be like a question which poses, how they intend to regulate something, and then everyone gets a chance to say what they think, and then the government sort of compiles it into a big document that says like 81% of respondents agree that we should include crypto assets in the regulated activities order or something. And so they are trying, and there definitely is, it's obviously a completely different landscape to the US, where there is at least they at least say that they want to encourage innovation in this jurisdiction. The things that are tricky about it is that, so if you are an onshore crypto asset business, then for a while now you've had to be registered with the FCA under the money laundering regs, which is different from authorization, which is what a traditional financial services firm would have, which is because there are no products right now that are regulated in a way that would mean you need to be authorized, but you need to be registered on that register that you can go and look at online. And the statistics for how many people get registration are so low. It's really, really hard, and maybe that's a good thing. The FCA is sort of drastically scaling up its capabilities in this area. So since the financial promotions regime came in, they've hired an inordinate number of staff, and it's hard to find the right type of people for that role. And so what we are sort of seeing in our communications with the FCA is a lot of the same questions that they're asking to try and understand what is happening in the market. A lot of the questions relate to staking activity. So that's like a sort of clear sign, I think, that that's something they're trying to get their heads around. It's tricky for everyone because the government sort of passed the financial promotions law and said it's in effect on 8th October. But that happened really, really quickly as a result of a panic over FTX, and the FCA hadn't even finalised its guidance yet. So everyone's sort of like seeing what each other is doing, which isn't a great place to start. But it's a much better place than some other jurisdictions find themselves in, I guess. So, yeah.
So it's not bad, but definitely better than the US. So.
Definitely better than the US.
Great,
yeah,
great.
That we can say with great certainty.
I think we have one more question, and then that might be all the time we have left.
Sure, it's a sort of similar question on, I guess, how bullish you are on the UK. And historically, the UK has benefited from, like I'm thinking in the derivative space, prime brokerage, in TradFi financial services, from being more, open and more flexible in terms of its regulation than the US as an offshore center to the US, but also less, regulatory than Europe itself, Germany, France, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that, helps the UK win in the long run, or do you see like new emerging kind of financial services centers like, in the Middle East or, in Asia, superseding the UK as the kind of global financial services hub?
Yeah, what I thought was really interesting is that the FCA, until the financial promotions regime came in, has essentially done nothing. There are already laws in place that restrict what crypto businesses can do, in the sense that you can't sell tokens that are security tokens, or you can't sell tokens that might qualify as units in a collective investment scheme, which is like a way that staking could arguably be caught. But the FCA hasn't made any attempt to, at least as far as we know publicly, not to clients I act for at least, it might have been happening behind the scenes, to go after any businesses, which is obviously very, very different to how that's happened in the US. And I think as a result, that might be sort of perceived globally, I don't know, as it being maybe slightly less forward-thinking than somewhere like in Dubai, where there's been a lot more effort in this space. I don't know how that will count in the long term, but I was surprised as a result of how little activity we'd seen from the FCA to date, how incredibly active they've been since the financial promotions regime came in. So I think there's a real sort of change of pace going on there.
Okay. Well, thank you guys very much for sitting through and listening to this regulatory panel. Please give a warm round of applause for Elizabeth, who took so much time out of her busy day to come speak with all of us. We'll be hanging out after this as well, so if you guys have any additional questions, feel free to come grab me or come grab Elizabeth, and we'll be very happy to chat. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, everyone.